Anthony was a loving person, you know, had a big heart.
Anthony was very charismatic. He was the type of person that people gravitated to. When I saw him coming through the door, I said, "Are you homicide?" He said yes, and then he told me that Anthony was gone. I felt like my skin wasn't touching me anywhere. I have never in my life felt that type of agony ever.
This person was a target. This wasn't a random act of violence.
There were two separate shooters shooting from the front and one from the back.
Police get another call about a fatal shooting, this time on the southeast side of town.
I could see my son. I knew it was him.
We need to look at that angle, that these could be related.
The never-ending cycle of revenge.
It might be sweet in the moment, but it leads to having to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life.
As the second biggest city in Texas, San Antonio encompasses diversity, both in its people and its neighborhoods.
San Antonio is built on a loop. It's a city that is in a big circle, and in that circle, there are siloed communities.
The northwest side of San Antonio, specifically close to the medical center area, is generally a quiet area. The med center is a good area to live in. There's also a university close by, so there's, you know, college students that live there.
It's just before 2 a.m. on January 7th, 2020, when the San Antonio Police Department is alerted to a situation in the parking lot of an apartment complex on the northwest side.
We did receive 911 calls from residents about a shooting. Reports where there were several shots fired.
Officers respond.
They did find a victim in the parking lot who had suffered apparent gunshot wounds.
Bystanders are attempting first aid on the young male. But damage is too severe.
Officers find that he is dead on arrival. There's nothing that can be done to save him.
Soon, homicide detectives arrive.
One thing that really stuck out to me was the fact that he had socks on his feet, but he didn't have shoes on. This told me that he probably lived in the apartment complex.
Once the medical examiner arrives, they're able to search through the victim's pockets to see if he happens to have any sort of identification on him, but unfortunately, he didn't.
A bystander speaks up, claiming to have seen the victim frequently coming and going from one of the apartments.
One of the witnesses pointed out they believed it was his vehicle. And so we ran the registration on that and came up with the name Anthony Saint.
Born in 1989, Anthony's early years were spent on the move.
Anthony was born at Maxwell Air Force Base. He was my oldest son when I was an airman in the Air Force. I got orders to another base. I was stationed in England, Upper Hayford, England, and we moved there where we lived for about a year and a half. After that, I separated from the military and then moved to San Antonio, Texas.
Eventually, Anthony's mother gave birth to 2 more sons.
Anthony, he had 2 little brothers, loved them to death. He was definitely like that father figure.
Anthony was a very, very active child. I learned very early on that he was full of energy. He loved football, and as he got older in high school, he became a high school football star. He was a running back, and he broke records.
he was a little more athletic than most of the guys at his school. Like they looked up to him and expected big plays from him, and he delivered that.
Anthony's hopes and dreams in high school was to be a football player. He wanted to play professionally. When he came to the awareness that he had to go to college and do well in college in order to do that, I feel like his dreams shifted to music and entertainment. Anthony wanted to be a rapper. He wanted to do other, things in the entertainment industry. And Patrick was the one who kind of stepped out there and learned how the business worked and then tried to draw his friends, Anthony included, into the pattern that was going to work for what they were trying to accomplish. So Patrick was his manager.
I believe that music was a way of him to stay connected to Chris. I believe that music was a way for him to express himself, his emotions, his feelings, what he was going through. A lot of the music that he wrote was based off of real life situations that he was experiencing.
Anthony came up with the idea that he wanted to do a song with the two of us. He wanted to rap and then wanted me to sing. So he wrote the lyrics, and then I just came up with a hook to it and sang behind it. We went to a studio in town where we put down the very first recording. He was over the hills excited to be in the studio with me.
The song is actually called Mama. That song was real near and dear to his heart. He really was passionate about having a song with his mom on there singing.
Anthony's talent was clear, but his biggest fans would always be his family.
His two little brothers copied him because he had the braids first, and then he ended up getting dreads, and then they got the dreads. But yeah, he wanted to see them succeed. He wanted to, when he learned things, he wanted to pass it down to them. His mama, that was his baby. He loved her more than anything on this earth.
My relationship with Anthony was a day-to-day. If I didn't talk to him every day, I spoke to him every other day. We were in constant communication about whatever was going on in his life at that particular time. And I am the type of mom that, I want to make sure that my kids are okay.
But on the evening of January 7th, 2020, police have tentatively identified Anthony as the victim of a shooting.
I could see that the victim had been shot multiple times. I couldn't tell where exactly, and we can't move the victims around. We have to wait for the medical examiner's investigator to get there.
Investigators hope one of the onlookers saw what happened.
Officers found that they were not eyewitnesses, but were ear witnesses to the incident. These individuals reported hearing multiple gunshots and then hearing screeching tires that were leading away from the apartment complex.
For police, that scene was really difficult to work. It's pretty dark, so the police were relying very heavily on their own lighting techniques by the police car lights.
They're looking for anything that could potentially lead them to find out what happened to this victim.
There was a cell phone near the victim. That being there told me that was probably the victim's cell phone. We weren't able to get into the cell phone. It was locked. So we didn't have a code, an access code or passcode to get into it.
And this could be something that ends up being a huge piece of evidence.
I look at the rest of the scene and I notice the shell casings that are laying about. There were about 9 markers locating shell casings. So there were 9 shell casings near the victim's body.
And they were all close to the body, suggesting that they were close range.
They found several shell casings on his body and around the body, really emphasizing the amount of firepower.
The police had a lot of work to do to figure out what exactly had happened here.
This wasn't a random act of violence.
After hours of working the scene in the dark, investigators head back to the station.
When we got back to our office, we did some research on the registration. We were able to get a photograph of the registered owner of one of the vehicles, and it did look like the victim at the scene. So around 4 or 5 hours after we've released the scene, we go back, because now we have daylight hours. We go back to look for any cameras in the area. We do notice that there are some around the office, which is located at an entry-exit point for the apartment complex. We had to wait for employees to show up. When they did show up, they confirmed they did have recorded footage of the area in front of the office building, which would show us vehicles coming and going. We were able to look at the footage. We did notice one vehicle come in, a small dark-colored SUV, and we were able to see it actually leave after the shooting. Couldn't get a license plate, couldn't see the people inside. It was a black Jeep Compass. Hubcap was missing off one of the tires, and then it had a broken taillight on the back.
They knew now that that vehicle was at the apartment complex at the time of the shooting. They were able to match up the time codes and know that that was most likely the suspect vehicle at that point.
When the officers were getting the surveillance video, they were also able to inquire as to the residents of the apartment that the witness has identified as seeing the victim going in and out of.
We knocked. The occupant did answer. It was a young female. She invited us in. She explained to us that she did know Mr. Sanks and that she was allowing him to stay there. She explained that she was a lifelong friend of his. The night before, she had gone out with some friends, did some drinking, came home around 12:40 a.m. She had bought some food.
The last time that she had seen the victim, he was still playing video games in the living room.
She explained that she's a very heavy sleeper, said she didn't hear anything as far as gunshots. She didn't know he was even gone until we knocked on the door and woke her up.
The roommate tells investigators that she knows Anthony's mother.
She currently was working with Mr. Sanks' mother at her hair salon, and she gave us that information of where that was located. And she told us that his mother would actually be there at that point, opening up for the day. We left the apartment complex and we wanted to get to her as soon as we could. We wanted her to know as soon as possible what happened.
When I saw him coming through the door, I said, "Are you homicide?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I just need you to say it." He said, "I need you to sit down." I said, "No, I need you to say it." And then he told me that Anthony was gone. At that point, I felt like my skin wasn't touching me anywhere. I have never in my life felt that type of agony ever.
The toughest part of this job is notifying a family when they've lost a loved one. You could automatically tell the love lost for this woman.
I did not know of anyone who would want to gun my son down in a parking lot in the middle of the night. I didn't know of anyone that would want to do this.
She didn't know of any problems he would have had with anyone, but we really needed more help. We told her we did have his phone, or we believed we had his phone, and we asked her if she knew the passcode for it.
We gave him the code to the phone, and that was it. And I asked him, "Please, I need you to find out who did this to my son." And he says, "I'm going to do my very best."
Getting into the cell phone that we believed was Mr. Sanks' phone was vital. We knew that he left that apartment and went out in the parking lot. We knew he didn't have shoes on, so he was probably going out there to meet someone he knew. That phone was probably going to tell us who he was communicating with and why he walked out in the parking lot.
Investigators checked the last activity on the phone.
They're able to locate on Facebook Messenger that the victim was going to meet someone right before he was murdered. And they were able to get that Facebook Messenger handle. There was a handle NHC Bobo that the victim was communicating with.
We knew that person came over. We knew they were communicating with Mr. Sanks. And we knew Mr. Sanks went out there to meet NHC Bobo in the parking lot. NHC Bobo was going to be someone we needed to find.
Detectives investigating the death of Anthony Sanks get their first break when they access phone messages sent to Anthony moments before he was gunned down.
Police now realize that they need to locate whoever this NHC Bobo is because, you know, they were in direct communication with Anthony almost right before he was murdered.
Hopeful to uncover NHC Bobo's true identity, investigators put the word out.
Homicide detectives rely on officers that are working undercover, working in specific units to be able to assist them in determining the identity of individuals that have nicknames.
While they wait to see if any leads turn up, detectives attend Anthony's autopsy.
I went to the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office. This case was very complex because he had multiple gunshot wounds and they were coming from different directions.
The medical examiner was able to identify 10 gunshot wounds. In this case, the victim was shot several times, 2 times, I believe, in the back, and then 8 entrance wounds in the front. It was safe to assume that there were 2 separate shooters.
The 2 shooters, the multiple gunshot wounds, and the fact that Anthony was lured to the parking lot all support a new theory.
This wasn't a random act of violence. We had to believe this was definitely a targeted hit or a targeted murder.
As far as who targeted Anthony, that remains a mystery.
We still didn't know who NHC Bobo was. So on January 14th, about a week after Mr. Sanks is murdered, I'm contacted by one of our detectives that works in an undercover capacity, works on the street. He had an informant come forward to him who had information about the murder of Mr. Sanks. He told me that this informant explained to him that NHC Bobo is an individual by the name of John Anthony Sheringhausen. We also found that there were text messages on Mr. Sanks' phone from John Sheringhausen. So we knew we had the right guy communicating with Mr. Sanks. The detective also gave me more information about some things that happened which might have been the reason why the murder happened.
The detective explains there was a beef between John Sheringhausen, Anthony Sanks, and a third man, Andrew Salazar.
Supposedly, Anthony Sanks' murder stemmed from a previous incident that had happened in June 2019. Andrew Salazar's home had gotten shot up in a drive-by shooting down on the south side of town. According to rumors on the street, Sheringhausen supposedly was the one who had committed that drive-by shooting.
So we looked into the shooting that occurred at Andrew Salazar's house in June of 2019. He was not present when the shooting happened. His family was there.
We just gotten home. It was just me, my wife, and my granddaughter. I heard popping noise, but I really didn't know they were shooting. My wife, she heard it louder than I did. She told me, hey, they shot at the house. I went outside and I looked. This probably was like a 12 or 13 rounds probably. And I got scared. We had to move out real quick, so we moved out within a month.
They didn't see who did it. They couldn't say who did it. We didn't know, if they were truly the targeted people or if it was a random thing that maybe caught in the crossfire or someone picked the wrong house to shoot up.
Investigators hope that one man might be able to shed light on the incident.
Talking to John Sheringhausen, was my big goal. Find out what he knew, what information he had. He had a lot of things to explain.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Sheringhausen's arrest, but he is nowhere to be found.
We'll solicit the assistance from the U.S. Marshal Service. We had people from those agencies helping us look for John Sheringhausen.
Then, just 2 weeks after Anthony Sank's death, more bloodshed.
So officers are dispatched to a 911 call where neighbors in the area heard multiple gunshots and saw two males running from a vehicle that was still at the location, and they could see an individual slumped over the steering wheel.
Officers respond, and they were able to then establish that the victim was Andrew Salazar.
Antonio police get word another man, allegedly connected to the case, has just been gunned down. Detectives are processing the scene where Andrew Salazar was shot dead inside his truck.
There was a bystander among the people who were there who by chance was going to meet up with the victim. The bystander identified the truck as the car that Andrew Salazar frequently drove, and that's how police were able to then run the plates and identify the next of kin.
His girlfriend called my wife and told her, "Have you talked to Andrew?" And my wife told him no. It goes, "There was a shooting." She gave us the address, and I kept trying to call him on the phone, and he wasn't answering. It was a pretty long drive going out there. I saw the truck. I used to work for the police department, so one of the officers recognized me there. And so they let me kind of go closer than I was supposed to. I could see my son. I knew it was him.
Andrew Salazar was born on March 22, 1991 in Fort Worth, Texas. The Salazar family relocated to San Antonio when Anthony was 3. That's where Anthony grew up, the third of 5 children.
They were all a year apart, but they were just siblings. They would get along with each other, and sometimes they would fight with each other. We're a real close-knit family.
Andrew was still a teenager himself when he started his own family.
Him and his girlfriend were real young. They were like close to 17, I think, 17, 16. At that time, they were living with us when she was pregnant. So they did live with us for pretty much like probably 2 years.
Despite his youth, Andrew was a devoted father who wanted to provide for his son.
Every school function he would go to, whenever they had the field trips, he would go to the field trips. He would be organizing all his birthday parties. His goal was to establish a business, either doing any kind of, remodeling or construction or anything like that. I mean, he had a lot of endeavors. He believed in doing a lot of things, but I guess he never had a chance to do it.
On January 22nd, 2020, Andrew's dreams are cut short when he's gunned down inside his truck.
Me and my wife were there, and we were crying. We called my kids. My other 2 sons got there too.
As Andrew's family attempts to process the sudden loss, detectives get to work.
There's a witness identified who she was coming home from work, and when she arrives at her house, she notices this pickup truck stopped in front of her home.
She sees brake lights first, then flashers. Then the next thing she hears is gunshots, and she observes 2 males running from the car with hoodies, both running in a northern direction.
Word of Andrew's death reaches Detective Size, who has been working the shooting death of Anthony Sanks for the past 2 weeks.
When I found out who the victim was, Andrew Salazar, I contacted that detective and told him, "Hey, I believe your case is going to be related to my case involving the murder of Anthony Sanks."
With Andrew Salazar dead, investigators are more eager than ever to speak with John Sheringhausen. On February 10th, 16 days after the second murder, investigators catch a break.
John Sheringhausen was found. He was with a friend They stopped him in a vehicle. He did speak with me. We were focused on the Anthony Sanks murder. He did say he knew who Sanks was, but denied knowing anything about the shooting as far as who did it and how. And then he's confronted with some of the evidence that we have, but we knew he was communicating with him. He knew he was kind of cornered and he had to explain his way out. So he tried.
Scheringhausen says that Andrew Salazar believed Anthony Sanks was responsible for the drive-by. And he was right.
He said that he actually did that shooting under the direction of Anthony Sanks, and that Andrew Salazar found out that it was him and confronted him about it.
Andrew hit him with a threat.
Scheringhausen explained that Andrew Salazar told him, "You will help me get back at Anthony Sanks, and if you don't, then I'll kill you."
But Scheringhausen says he didn't accompany Andrew Salazar to kill Anthony Sanks. Instead, he claims another man took on that role.
He said that we needed to get Anthony Jiggy Nash.
Scheringhausen claims his role was limited to loaning the man his phone so they could use it to lure Anthony Sanks outside.
Anthony Sanks was his good friend. He tells detectives he was forced by Andrew Salazar to give over his phone, and that Andrew Salazar had been the one that had messaged the victim, setting the victim up to be murdered, that it wasn't him. He tells detectives that Anthony Nash and Andrew Salazar took his phone and left in Anthony Nash's vehicle to go over and set Anthony Sanks up to be murdered.
I asked him, "Can you give me some more specific detail about the vehicle?" And he stops and thinks, and he says, "Well, yeah, it had a broken taillight, the broken driver's side taillight." Well, and he said it was a black Jeep Compass. We were able to take the information he gave, compare it to the video. It was a Jeep, just like he was explaining to us.
Detectives start to look a little bit more into Anthony Nash. They do discover that his vehicle registration matches the vehicle that they saw on surveillance leaving the apartment complex the night of Anthony Sanks' murder. They realize some of the things that Scheringhausen is telling them is actually true.
I would say that for individuals who have experienced targeted violence, so in this particular case, a drive-by shooting, they might be experiencing a lot of different emotions, fears, anxieties. This could lead to that ideology of revenge, wanting to get back at whoever did this, teach them a lesson, potentially show them, I'm not afraid of you. They think, once I complete the act of revenge, I'm gonna feel better and this person's gonna know, not to mess with me. But that's where we're wrong. It might be sweet in the moment, but that's temporary. In the long term, people don't have long-term satisfaction. They feel much worse. It takes up a lot of space in their brain and inevitably leads to what becomes the cycle of revenge and potentially having to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life because you never know when potentially somebody's gonna come back and pay you back for what you've done.
He was not there when Anthony Nash and Andrew Salazar gunned Anthony Sanks down. But investigators aren't so sure he is being honest about his role.
He gave very detailed information about what happened when they got there. That Sanks came out and that Nash got out and started shooting him, and that Drew came around and also shot Anthony Sanks, but claiming he wasn't there. To have that kind of detail, we didn't think people involved would tell him in that good of detail what happened. So we knew that he was there.
Investigators confront him. Instead of coming clean, Scheringhausen changes the subject.
Knowing that he was getting really deeper and deeper cornered as far as Anthony Sanks' murder, I think he tried to help himself by providing information about Andrew Salazar's murder.
The information he gives the detectives about that is that Anthony Nash, who he called Jiggy, got really nervous after Anthony Sank's murder and believed that Andrew Salazar was setting him up to turn him into the police. And so Anthony Nash got concerned about this and that he was the one who killed Andrew Salazar.
He again denied that he was there. He claimed that Andrew was murdered by Anthony Nash. Nash pulled a gun out and shot Salazar in the truck. And then fled after that.
Detectives make sure Sheringhausen knows they aren't buying his claims of innocence.
To have that kind of detail, we knew that he was there, he was in that Jeep. After interviewing John Sheringhausen, he was told that he was under arrest for the murder of Anthony Sanks.
Investigators attempt to track down Anthony Nash.
They were unable to locate him. They spoke with his father, who said that soon after these murders that he had been in a mental institution. And after the hospitalization had gone to Louisiana.
We didn't know where he was. We had him in the system. We had a bolo that we needed to speak to him.
Finally, after over a year of looking, investigators get word that Anthony Nash is back in San Antonio.
We had just enough probable cause in the Anthony Sanks case to arrest Nash. Just enough. It came down to Sheringhausen, what he provided to us, able to see that vehicle that was involved. We were able to say, you know, that we knew Nash had that type of vehicle. Arrest warrant was obtained on July 21st of 2021, and he was arrested at his mother's apartment.
When detectives went to speak with him, he was unwilling to give any information.
Even with 2 arrests, detectives still have work to do.
After Anthony Nash is arrested and charged with the murder of Anthony Sanks, I started to dive more into the Andrew Salazar case. If I could get closer to arresting Nash for that murder as well.
Investigators revisit a piece of evidence that had been handed over by Andrew's father. After his son's vehicle was released back to the family, Jesus Salazar found something.
And I found some keys to a vehicle in the truck. So that's what I recovered those, and I called the detective, and I told him, you know, I got these keys.
He found the key in there, didn't know whose it was or what it was for, and thought it might be important, so that's why he gave it to police. He said he also noticed in a social media photograph of Sheringhausen and Nash together that it looked like the same key that was hanging on the belt loop of Anthony Nash.
Nash had those keys that were inside my truck. I said, look, those are the same keys, keychain. So I send the picture to the detective.
It was exactly like the key that you could see in the photograph that's hanging on the belt loop of Anthony Nash.
The key was great evidence to show that he was involved.
It's good evidence, but I wanted more. So my next step was then to get phone records.
They were able to get the phone records for Anthony Nash, and they were able to determine that his phone was in the area at the time that Andrew Salazar was murdered.
At this point, after I get those phone records, now I have enough. I have enough to say that Anthony Nash was definitely involved in the murder of Andrew Salazar. So a charge was made against him in that case as well.
Investigators believe more players in the 2 killings remain unidentified. But with no witnesses and no one talking, they focus on Nash and Sheringhausen. A theory about Sheringhausen takes shape.
It was starting to feel more and more like John Sheringhausen was putting this all together, and that it was some type of a power play by him to get rid of these 2 guys so he could maybe get a bigger name for himself on the streets.
But when it comes to the second crime, investigators cannot prove his involvement.
charge was not brought against him in the Andrew Salazar case.
Law enforcement also cannot prove that Sheringhausen fired any shots the day Anthony Sanks was killed. But prosecutors are confident they can still hold him accountable.
We relied almost exclusively on the cell phone and Facebook Messenger evidence that we had. Anything that an individual would do to promote, assist in the plan or in the carrying out of a murder makes that person just as guilty as an individual who shoots and kills.
As John Sheringhausen's trial approaches, prosecutors piece together what they believe took place the day Anthony Sanks was gunned down.
I believe that Andrew Salazar was out for revenge and talked John Sheringhausen into helping him set up Anthony Sanks to be killed. I believe that Anthony Nash drove them over there to kill Anthony Sanks. I believe that once at the location, I think that John Sheringhausen got out of the vehicle, that Anthony Sanks went to go and meet him, and then Andrew Salazar got out and began shooting, and then John Sheringhausen began shooting too.
But when Sheringhausen's trial begins in October 2021, prosecutors must stick to what they can prove.
I could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was one of the shooters without any eyewitnesses, without anybody being able to say that he had told them that he had murdered the victim. However, we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the individual was at a very minimum a party to the murder. There was no getting out of him being present with his phone when Anthony Sanks was murdered. At the same time his phone was messaging the victim, he was also messaging a girlfriend, referencing that he was going to hit a lick. Hitting a lick either means murdering someone or robbing someone. As soon as he was done, he was going to go over and meet her. Those messages were sent right before the murder. And so based on that information, we knew without a doubt that he was present at the murder. He aided, he planned, he assisted in this murder, and that's why he was guilty. As soon as that evidence was presented, his attorney was approaching me, telling me that his client had changed his mind. His client had decided to change his plea to guilty.
It became so damning that Mr. Sheringhausen had no choice. And that's when he, of course, changed his mind.
The judge sentenced the defendant, John Sheringhausen, to 40 years in prison for the murder of Anthony Sanks.
In February 2023, Anthony Nash accepts a deal.
I did not believe that Anthony Nash was a shooter in the Anthony Sanks murder. I believe that he was the getaway driver. Anthony Nash's vehicle was driven into and out of the parking lot, and the information from the witnesses at the scene, the shots were very quickly followed by screeching tires. So I did not believe that the person who drove the vehicle away from the scene was one of the individuals who had been out shooting. I believe that his involvement, his culpability was lesser. We offered him 20 years in prison to run concurrently on both murders. And ultimately, he accepted that instead of going to a trial.
We never were able to clearly define that, but I'm pretty satisfied with the fact that John Sheringhausen manipulated all these people, constructed this entire thing, and made it happen. And because of his actions, you know, 2 people lost their lives, 2 young people lost their lives, and 2 families were affected forever by it.
I don't think that closure exists. I think that you get to the place where you get used to it. You get to the place where you wrap your head around it. You do things differently to cope with it. But I don't think that closure really exists. There was a sense of possibly that justice would be served, but not relief at all.
Because when you get revenge on somebody, most of the time it's gonna be somebody else that wanna come and get revenge back on you. And then it just turns into the never-ending cycle of revenge.
Revenge doesn't really pay back anything. I don't believe in revenge.
Bensonhurst, New York is known as the Little Italy of Brooklyn. It's a neighborhood that carries with it a deep sense of pride, tradition, and heritage. But in the 1980s, those same qualities gave Bensonhurst a reputation as a racist community, particularly toward African Americans. And in August of 1989, long-simmering racial tensions erupt in a night of bloodshed, leaving teenager Yusef Hawkins dead at the hands of a white mob.
Sir, what is your name?
Joseph Farmer.
The hunt for his killer will send police into a standoff with organized crime. Meanwhile, Brooklyn's black community rises up to lead the most explosive protest in city history, demanding justice for Yusef and taking a sharp bite out of the Big Apple's reputation as America's melting pot. Bensonhurst is situated in southwest Brooklyn, just a stone's throw away from the glitz and glamour of Manhattan. Yet it feels like a world away.
Bensonhurst is part of Brooklyn. Brooklyn is part of New York City, so it's not rural, it's not remote, nothing luxurious. It is a middle-class working neighborhood.
The community was settled by Italian immigrants in the mid-20th century.
They call it the Little Italy of Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, and it was. Basically, it was an Italian area from back in the 50s. And how it happens is, you know, they get off the boat and they follow each other, right? You stick with your own kind. The restaurants are great. The food is phenomenal. The clothing stores, you know, we like our Italian. We like to look good. During the Saturday Night Fever era, that's all Bensonhurst guys.
By 1989, Bensonhurst had become a close-knit neighborhood filled with working families.
On Sundays, they would close this 4-lane street down and play stickball and music and barbecue and everybody making the sauce.
It was considered a very safe neighborhood.
But this safety came at a cost.
When you think Italian, it's kind of stereotypical, but you think about the mafia, right? But this is true in this scenario. It was a mob town.
A lot of the people in the neighborhood at that time credited the mob with keeping it a safe neighborhood. The suggestion was that if somebody were to try something here in Bensonhurst, something would happen to them.
However, protection was only available to Bensonhurst Italian residents. Others, especially those who looked different, were shunned.
Bensonhurst was a predominantly Italian white neighborhood, and many people who lived there viewed African Americans as being the source of all of our urban problems. And they didn't want black people living in their neighborhood, shopping in their neighborhood, driving through their neighborhood.
Bensonhurst was very provincial in this way. If you were a black person walking down the street in Bensonhurst, and if you were walking past the wrong business, like certain social clubs, back then it would not be unusual for 1 or 2 people to stop you and say, "Where are you going? What are you doing here?"
And this attitude extended well beyond Bensonhurst borders.
Bensonhurst wasn't alone. There are many other neighborhoods throughout the city where we find the same attitudes. New York in general was like the melting pot that will not melt.
New York is segregated and racist. This is the New York we're talking about. The Big Apple never gave us a bite.
And over time, segregation set the stage for bloodshed.
During that period of time, there were several racially motivated murders.
In 1986, Willie Turks, for example, was the MTA driver who got pulled out of a car and, killed by a white mob. And then in 1989, the Central Park Five was also going on.
It's a symptom, right? But it tells us that there is an undercurrent of hatred and hostility amongst the races.
So New York was a divided New York, and of course all that exploded on August 23rd, 1989.
Shortly after 9 p.m. on that fateful night, the NYPD 62nd Precinct receives a panicked 911 call.
Police, Davis Avenue and 20th Avenue. Somebody just got shot. Somebody just got shot. A bunch of white boys just shot a black guy. They were on foot? Yeah, on foot. A bunch of white boys. Thank you. Police will be there.
When police get the call, they're immediately on edge.
I got the chills because it was a bunch of white kids who jumped a bunch of black kids. And I said, let's go and pack a bag because it's going to be a long one. And sure enough, it was.
Police arrive at the scene and find a young black man has been shot multiple times in the chest.
He was bleeding profusely. An emergency medical service ambulance was dispatched to the scene, and the medics on board the ambulance tried to do what they could to give initial first aid. The scene at that point was kind of pandemonium.
The victim's 3 friends are also at the scene, and they identify him as 16-year-old East New York resident Yusef Hawkins.
He was taken to a hospital nearby, and the doctors began their work. They knew they had their work cut out for them.
Yusef Hawkins was born and raised in the predominantly black neighborhood of East New York in Brooklyn.
Yusef and his friends were normal kids, go to school, do their homework, ride their bike around the neighborhood. Just a sort of a normal kind of life that they were living as young people at the time.
His family, loved him. He was just a beautiful person, had a sense of humor, and very sensitive to people's feelings and suffering and stuff like that.
He was just like a really well-rounded kid, played a lot of sports, hung out a lot with his friends in the community.
Yusef had plans to attend Transit Tech, a vocational school in East New York. After graduating, he dreamed of becoming a technical engineer.
He wanted to be a subway motorman. His words, according to his mother, had been, I want to drive the train. And he did well in school.
He was ambitious. He was extremely intelligent.
So how did this promising young man end up shot on the streets of Bensonhurst?
He wasn't participating in anything that would make sense of this story,
He was just a typical New York City teenager. He was not in trouble with the law in any way at all.
As detectives questioned Yusef's friends, they learned the group had traveled to Bensonhurst that evening to buy a used car.
They saw an ad, they were interested in buying a car, they were going to go and look at it.
Brooklyn is a big place, and going to Bensonhurst was a place that he had never been, his friends had never been. They might as well have been going to Rhode Island. It was an adventure, and when they got out of the subway in Bensonhurst, they had become lost, and they continued to walk. There were no cell phones in those days. They were trying to get directions by looking at a map.
They just walked down a street they'd never been on before, in a neighborhood they'd never been to before, with this illusion of feeling secure when they absolutely were not. They were walking into an incredibly lethal situation.
From their perspective, they had reached a place where there was a schoolyard, where there were a large number of white kids who were hanging around there.
Yusef's friends say that the crowd of 20 to 30 white men began following them and yelling racial slurs and threatening them with baseball bats.
You can imagine the fear. It's like, why are these people saying these things? Why are they harassing me? Why are they threatening to do bodily harm? Why are there baseball bats? I'm sure there was a lot of fear that came upon them in a very short amount of time.
The crowd surrounds Yusef and his friends outside of a store.
They had nowhere to run.
Detectives learned that a young white man emerged from the crowd and fired several shots into Yusef's chest. At the sound of gunshots, the mob scattered.
We know that 3 shots found their way into Yusuf Hawkins's chest. Yusuf collapsed onto the sidewalk. He was still clutching a Snickers bar.
Yusuf's friends say the men that attacked them were strangers. They have no idea why they were targeted, other than the color of their skin.
These 3 young men didn't pose a threat to anybody. They weren't provocative. They were there minding their own business. They were baby-faced boys. They weren't men. They had no idea what they were walking into.
And by the very next morning, all hell will break loose.
This was a different type of situation, and what none of us knew was how this was going to affect New York City as a whole.
The New York City Police Department is investigating the shooting of 16-year-old Yusuf Hawkins in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn. Detectives have reason to believe this was a racially motivated attack.
Early reports was that there was a large group of young men that had congregated in a schoolyard where they surrounded 3 young black men who had walked into the neighborhood. And from there was a shooting.
In the chaotic aftermath, Yusuf was rushed to an area hospital.
He was bleeding profusely. He was taken to a hospital nearby, and the doctors began their work.
The surgeon who opened his chest at Kings County Hospital and tried to repair the heart, and he said that Yusuf's heart literally fell apart in his hands.
It was a murder. It was tragic. It was a murder.
Within hours of the shooting, Yusuf's murder is front-page news.
When the incident first happened, it was something that you saw on the 11 o'clock news. And the New York Daily News, the New York Post.
The information that got out was this was a young man who was black, who was shot by a white person after being pursued by a bat-wielding mob of white young men.
As word spreads, community members question why Yusuf would ever set foot in Bensonhurst.
It was kind of like whispered amongst other black people, like, we don't go over there, it's not too safe over there, because they don't like black people. They don't treat black people very well.
Older people have fear and say, hey, you need to not venture into those areas. So I think Yusuf knew that there was potential danger, but I think that he was insistent upon being a human being that should be allowed to walk wherever I please and buy a car wherever I want to buy a car. And unfortunately, it cost him his life.
At the scene, detectives search for potential witnesses.
This is 1989, so we didn't have video cameras on every pole, and there was not a lot of forensic evidence, and the police will start to canvass houses, which means they'll go door to door, knocking on doors, ringing doorbells, asking people proactively, did you see anything, did you hear anything, what do you know?
There's always that little lady that looks out the window. There's always that nosy guy who's taking out the garbage. You gotta find him. So I went to 123 68th Street, and Mr. Smith didn't see anything. But Mr. Bond downstairs heard the shots, looked outside, saw a bunch of kids running.
The witness says he had seen several of the kids before, hanging outside a local candy shop.
There was this candy store, it was called Sal's Snacks and Candies, run by a guy who they referred to as Sal Squid or Mr. Squid. And there was a collage on the wall in there. The collage was just random pictures of neighborhood characters that were slapped on a piece of oak tag. I'm sure that it was cool to have your picture up there.
It was a collage of a whole bunch of the neighborhood kids who were at the schoolyard.
It was like a photo lineup on steroids. So the detectives took that collage and they used it sort of as a photo array to identify potential suspects.
Detectives ask area residents if any of these teenagers were part of the mob that attacked Yusuf.
They found who they could from that group. If they didn't know the name, they talked to people who would give them the name.
Huge step forward. A huge step forward. If we didn't have that collage, I'd probably still be out in the street looking for guys.
Just as the investigation starts to gain traction, though, residents of Bensonhurst close ranks around their own.
What happened was, I find you. I need your son. Okay, then your son's being held. You call up his best friend's father and say, listen, don't let them take him because my son's collared.
People in the neighborhood, telephone, telegraph, tell a neighbor, were quick to tell other people, hey, the cops are arresting everybody. They're questioning everybody. Tell your son to take a ride to Manhattan.
But as Bensonhurst shuts down, Brooklyn heats up.
It hit the media, and I was so livid. I was so angry. Not another one.
Here you had a kid who was murdered. 16-year-old little boy who played basketball, who loved to ride his bike. You had him murdered.
The energy from our black community was at the highest pitch level it could possibly ever be. Everybody was angry and fired up.
I think that people were outraged and they were willing to die. I think that is what everyone felt. They felt like their son had died and they were willing to die.
The community rose up and said, oh no, this is not 1889, this is 1989. We don't do that anymore. But as the days went on, prominent folks in the African American community began to rise up and say what happened here was a grave injustice. We cannot allow this kind of violence to go on because then our city will go up in flames.
The public response was immediate. The city was boiling over, and within a short period of time, white people and black people began to mobilize.
We need to go to Bensonhurst and make them feel uncomfortable just how we feel uncomfortable every single day. We need to go and stand for what we believe in. We need to go fight for black lives because if not, they're gonna keep killing us.
Murder of 16-year-old Yusef Hawkins in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn has sparked widespread anger and exposed an ugly truth about New York City.
The reason for the visceral public reaction, in particular in the black community, was the fact that he was not armed. You know, he and his friends, they weren't going there to pick a fight. They were going there to look at a car. And so the fact that he was on an ordinary errand and wound up losing his life, that is what caused people to feel so much outrage.
And to make matters worse, attacks like the one against Yusef were not just isolated to Bensonhurst. They were happening throughout the city.
So in the 80s, there was huge racial tensions in New York.
So if you look at that time frame, many incidents of black folks, you know, getting killed, you know, either by the police or, you know, by angry white folks. And so you did have sort of that backdrop to what happened with Yusef.
In 1982, Willie Turks was walking in his car in Gravesend, not far from Bensonhurst, white community in Brooklyn. They snatch him out of his car, kill him.
Also, a few years prior to this, you had a mob that had chased Michael Griffith to his death on the Belt Parkway.
Then we had the incident with Bernard Goetz on the subway, which was a huge media frenzy. It had a white man shooting several black youths on a subway car. 1989 was an extraordinary year because we also had the Central Park 5, where you had a white woman that was raped. And they settled on this narrative about these black youths, and we now know that it was a lie.
This cycle keeps continuing to happen over and over. The same traumatic stories just done in different ways. And so I think that a lot of people were starting to see that whenever our children leaves our community, they're not safe. They're either being accused of something or they're being killed. So there was a lot of racial tension going on.
Race relations, it was simmering. It was simmering. And it took just one incident to sort of, you know, blow the whole pot off, the simmering tensions.
Given recent history, Brooklyn's black community decides enough is enough.
If we don't take matters into our own hands and protect us and protect our own children, who's gonna do it? Who's gonna do it?
So now you got young black people and old black people stepping out to the forefront saying no more. There was this energy out here in black leadership during that time, galvanized it and pointed it in the right direction.
One of the most vocal leaders of the movement is Reverend Al Sharpton, who organizes numerous marches from Yusef's East New York neighborhood straight into the belly of the beast in Bensonhurst.
In 1955, it was Martin Luther King. In 1987, it was Al Sharpton. He led the first riot into Bensonhurst. And he marched black folks into that neighborhood.
Hundreds of protesters turn out for the march, including City Councilman and Black Panther Charles Barrett.
I said, hey, I'm not gonna sit here angry. We gotta turn this pain to power. Okay, this march, it was the threat that you will not be in peace as long as you're allowing your neighbor and your system to oppress us like this. No, you're not gonna live in peace.
I had been invited by Reverend Sharpton to come along on the first march. I remember young men in the back of the bus with a boombox who were playing Fight the Power by Public Enemy. But there were elder people. There were one or two mothers with strollers. These were people that we would not see at demonstrations of this type in New York City under normal circumstances. But to these people, Yusuf Hawkins was their child.
In Bensonhurst, a chilling sight awaits the protesters.
It's like a powder keg out here. The tension, you can cut it with a knife. I remember marching and seeing how our community was so fired up. And then the response, the reception, you thought you were in the South. I couldn't believe my eyes. A wedding party came with the groom and their maids of honor, whatever, on the corner that called us the N-word. A wedding party.
All of a sudden, it didn't feel like Brooklyn anymore. It felt like Mississippi. It felt like Alabama. I remember Reverend Sharpton being asked by a reporter, do you think there might be violence? Reverend Sharpton said to her, there's already been violence. Yusuf is dead. But the marchers remained peaceful. This was an amazingly peaceful demonstration for 600 people who were afraid for their children, afraid for themselves.
Al Sharpton was a beast. He went and marched in Bensonhurst 20 times.
But as the rallies continue, Reverend Sharpton is attacked, just 1 block from where Yusuf was shot.
Everything just snowballed. Sharpton gets stabbed by an Italian kid with a knife.
Sharpton is rushed to a hospital, but survives his injuries. And in the days and weeks that follow, he continues to drive the movement, even while he heals.
I seriously do not think that Reverend Al Sharpton has ever gotten enough credit. He was the spokesman for an urban civil rights movement.
But as Sharpton's movement rages on the streets, detectives are working the case, and one name has risen to the top of the suspect list.
There was a young man who was a little bit of an up-and-comer, ended up saying some things and doing some things that led to the death of Yusuf Hawkins.
As white residents clash with black protesters over the murder of Yusuf Hawkins, his family steps back from the fray to mourn his loss.
There was a large crowd of people who were gathered at the funeral home.
I looked at the people at the funeral, how sad they were, how angry they were, how frustrated they were. And if that could happen to him, it could happen to any one of us.
Meanwhile, in Bensonhurst, police are shaking down witnesses for information.
You're looking at a mob of 35 kids. And of course, everybody in Bensonhurst who had any connection to any of these people knew exactly what happened and who was involved. So there was no shortage of people to talk to.
Surprisingly, every witness gives the same name.
During the cultivating of the witnesses, the one kid that everyone was talking about was Keith Mandela.
According to witnesses, Keith Mandela was not just a member of the mob that attacked Yusuf, he was the reason it formed in the first place. So detectives called Keith in for questioning.
He was, acting like most kids from the neighborhood. I don't talk to the cops. So I kind of said, listen, when you go to Rikers, you're going to be a part of a group that murdered a black boy. You're not going to make it in there. You're going to be somebody's girlfriend. And he broke. And that's when we found out what it was about.
According to Keith, the trouble all started with a girl named Gina.
Keith had started a relationship with a young lady by the name of Gina Feliciano. She moved in upstairs above the store where they hung out. And he started a physical relationship with her.
The Gina and Keith situation is something that people in the neighborhood had varying things to say about. And some of their comments were directed very badly at Gina and her virtue.
She was just a plaything for Keith.
According to Keith, Gina flew into a rage after learning she wasn't the only woman in his life.
They told us there was going to be a party, which she expected him to attend with her, and he said, no, I have a girlfriend. And with that, she got very upset. You know, she got insulted by that. And she said, my brother is coming down tonight with his friends to get you.
She told him he's going to bring some of his friends with him who are also black, and they're going to beat the crap out of Keith and his friends.
So one boy tells another, another tells another, and before you know it, that night, there's 20, 24 kids on the corner gonna protect and defend their friend Keith because these guys are coming.
They were waiting for, as one of them put it, black kids to come. And in their mind, there was going to be trouble.
And once Yusef and his friends arrived on that street corner, the witnesses are all in agreement about what happened next.
You've got a bunch of young men with golf clubs and bats waiting in a schoolyard for people they believed were going to make trouble. They saw three people who, in their minds, fit the description of these people they thought were coming.
The white teenagers, they didn't have a specific target, they didn't have a name, they just had a skin color. And so when they saw Yusef and his friends, they just assumed that it was those boys.
Yusef and his friends found themselves surrounded by a group of white kids. They were penned in, walled in, whatever you want to say. They had no place to go. And they just parted like the Red Sea. The gunman raised his hand and shot Yusef Hawkins in the chest.
The witnesses say Keith Mondello didn't fire that weapon, and neither did they.
He was like, I didn't shoot him. I didn't want this. This is not what, I didn't want this.
Given the racial undertones of the case, the district attorney decides to prosecute to the fullest extent of the law.
And a decision was made, if a person had a bat, that person would be charged with murder, because in this case, the fact that these young men were unable to move from where they were, they couldn't run, they couldn't hide. And so whoever was there with a bat would have been as responsible for Yusef Hawkins' death as the young man who had the gun.
The NYPD rounds up almost a dozen members of the bat-wielding mob.
The names that came up pretty quickly were John Vento, Steve Carreri, and Charlie Stressler, who was the player who brought the baseball bats, helped to whip up the crowd and distribute those bats to the young men that were there waiting to join the fight.
But the gunman himself remains at large.
They wanted the gunman, but nobody was giving him up. Everybody was deaf and dumb. Everybody was like, no, I didn't see that part of it. I ran away. So knowing who the gunman was the big puzzle. And for NYPD, it was the big prize.
Weeks after the murder of Yusef Hawkins, protesters continue to flood the streets of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn.
I think the reason why Bensonhurst became ground zero for activism was because black people was fed up.
It's just not going to be business as usual. You disrupted our life, we're disrupting yours. Nobody should be resting in peace for what you did to Yusef Hawkins. So that's why it was important for us to keep going.
My fire was ignited. Like, I hated racism. right? I hated anybody who participated in racism. I wanted my people to thrive, to survive, to like overcome.
As the protests continue, New York City investigators work to find the alleged gunman.
You're taking a 17, 18-year-old kid and you're telling him, you're going to jail for murder. I didn't do it. Well, who did? And that's how it came about. Guys were saying, well, this guy Joey Farmer, he's not part of our crew, but somebody brought him along.
Detectives dig into Joey Farmer's background, learning he keeps dangerous company.
Joey had mob connections.
The kid, Farmer, comes from a hard knock family. They were connected. They were heavy into drugs. They owned a construction company. Yeah, they were tough.
There was this traffic accident when he was a boy, which he was injured, and the injury was to his head. He was considered to be very slow.
Joey Farmer is not, he's no rocket scientist. You know what Joey Farmer reminded me of? There's a wise guy out there, he's in jail now. Gas pipe Casio. I don't think he's got the intelligence of a squirrel, but he was vicious.
But there's just one problem. Joey Farmer has disappeared.
Well, we do know that he went into hiding.
So, police flood every street in Bensonhurst, which spells trouble for the mob, who all but run the community.
The NYPD started busting down doors of Gambino family card games. Usually it got left alone. Not this time. The heat was on. The detectives wanted somebody to give up this person who shot Yusuf Hawkins.
And as police conduct raids, protesters continue to swarm the area, bringing with them more unwanted attention.
The mafia was out there trying to tell everybody to be cool so the demonstrations could eventually stop and they can go back to business as usual.
Finally, after weeks of chaos, the mafia decides hiding Joey Farmer is bad for business.
People had so much heat on the neighborhood.
Sammy the Bull had a meeting with the people in the neighborhood at his pool hall. And during this meeting, told the kids and some other mob-inclined people that Joey Farmer could be given up, that was okay with him.
These demonstrations had impact, had economic impact, had social impact on that community, and it worked, and they gave him up.
On August 31st, 1989, authorities take Farmer into custody.
Joey Farmer was in upstate New York at that time, and he ended up surrendering to the police. There was no drama.
Joseph Farmer.
Farmer is charged with murder. He pleads not guilty.
Nobody pled out in this case. Everybody went to trial.
But for New York's black citizens, the fight for justice is only beginning. Over the next few months, the politics of race will take center stage, and Yusuf's death will open the door for New York's first black mayor, David Dinkins.
Mayor Dinkins ran on the heels of a rebellion. They ran saying that they were going to get justice for black people, that they were going to clean up the city and get things right.
Hatred. He was an unarmed kid being chased by someone with a gun.
Racism.
That hate and disrespect for black bodies was next level.
They're trying to keep us from telling our story.
Stories will be told. Truth revealed.
I just couldn't imagine losing my 17.
Black people stepping out to the forefront, saying no more. And there was this energy out here, and black leadership during that time galvanized it.
When Yusuf was killed, Ed Koch was the mayor of New York City. And after the death of Yusuf, people were not all that happy with his performance.
This is not a community that should be described as a racist community.
Mayor Koch backed down and said, hey, this is not a racist community. The next day, we the people are out there marching, and they're calling us Starface, threatening us, throwing things.
As protests in Bensonhurst rage on, 8 young men have been arrested for Yusuf Hawkins' murder.
If we look at what occurred that night, the mob chases Yusuf and his friends. There were guys with bats There were guys with golf clubs. They're at the mercy of this mob. And that's when Joey Fama moves forward and shoots Yusef. And so all those people with the bats acting in concert with the shooter.
It couldn't have happened without the cooperation of others. So we charged 8 different people with murder.
On April 2nd, 1990, the trial begins for the alleged gunman, Joey Fama.
Joey Fama's story was essentially that he was not the shooter. He didn't say, if that was the case, who the shooter was.
Prosecutors call witnesses to the stand to refute Joey's story, that he wasn't the shooter. Among them is another Bensonhurst teenager named Frankie Ty, but Frankie's testimony comes with risks.
Part of the trial of Joseph Fama relied on testimony from Frankie Ty, who was a young kid who had changed his story on some things, was under psychiatric care. Not a great witness, according to Joey's attorney, but who nonetheless had told the story at the trial of Joey Fama shooting Yusef Hawkins.
On May 17, 1990, the jury returns a verdict. Fama is found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to over 32 years in prison.
One guy that I would never let out of jail. Never. He stole a bar of soap. Give him 5 more years. You know what I mean? Because that one guy ruined so many lives. Ruined so many things.
Keith Mondello, the teen whose ill-fated romance sparked the mob violence, is also tried for murder.
Their suggestion had been if you didn't have Keith Mondello, you didn't have 35, 40 hyped up young men gathering in a schoolyard with baseball bats and golf clubs. And so Keith was largely blamed for this having occurred at all.
In May 1990, Keith is acquitted of murder, but convicted on a slew of other charges, including riot, unlawful imprisonment, and possession of a weapon. He is sentenced to 5.5 to 16 years in prison, but ultimately serves 8 before being paroled.
The ringleader, the one who brought everybody together, got 8 years. 8 years? People get 8 years for stealing something, not for organizing a lynch mob to kill somebody.
Of the 8 teens brought to trial in Yusef's murder, only 4 end with convictions.
These were really difficult cases because nobody wanted to cooperate. It was like pulling teeth, having witnesses disappear, having witnesses go hostile on us. So we had a mix of convictions and acquittals.
And though it feels like injustice to many, Yusef's story continues echoing across the city. In fact, he helped change New York political history.
In 1989, Ed Koch was seeking a 4th term as mayor of New York City. His main primary challenger was David Dinkins, who was African American. So for David Dinkins, he was trying to become the first black mayor in the history of New York City. One of the things that people were saying was Ed Koch doesn't care about black folks. He's not out there saying this is wrong. Now, David Dinkins wasn't hollering and screaming about Yusef Hawkins, but he was speaking in a way that resonated with people. He was speaking with compassion and with sympathy.
What I'd like to talk about is how we need to bring our city together.
After defeating Ed Koch in the city's Democratic primary race, David Dinkins won the city's mayoral election in November 1989.
So this is what the legacy of Yusef Hawkins left. He was great in life. He was a beautiful person in life, but he was even greater in death, that he presented a symbol of assertiveness, a symbol of, I'll go wherever I want to go, a symbol of, in spite of all of this racism, wasn't infected by the disease we're fighting against. I was a good man, and I loved human beings. And for that, we are eternally grateful to the family and the spirit of Yusef Hawkins. Bensonhurst is different now. I think it's largely Asian and white. Now the Asian community might be larger in Bensonhurst now.
If you go back, it was like these folks were hollering and screaming and yelling, trying to preserve something that was dying anyway. the vast majority of white America did not ascribe to the views that were being expressed by these folks. And if you look at Bensonhurst today, that sentiment is not there anymore. Not there anymore at all.
Oakland, California, with its sunny skies and mild weather, is often called the bright side of the bay. Home to over 400,000 residents, the city is one of the most diverse in the nation. But the city also has a dark side. And in 2007, Oakland's violence leapt off the front pages when a prominent reporter was gunned down in broad daylight. But Oakland also has a very different kind of reputation.
Oakland has a dark side, ranking amongst the most dangerous cities in California.
In the 1980s, Oakland became well known for the crack epidemic. Our all-out gang warfare, murders on the street, drove us to the #1 violent city in the state of California.
In spite of that, the residents of Oakland remain fiercely proud of their history, especially those in the Black community.
We have a sense of pride here in this city that's not matched by anyone.
Oakland has always had such a strong history, from the Panthers to the Black businesses here to gospel.
African-American history here in Oakland is deep, rich, varied, and it goes way back to the Transcontinental Railroad. Its terminus was here in Oakland, not in San Francisco. And a lot of African-Americans who worked the railroad settled in what is West Oakland today.
But even in a tight-knit community like Oakland, contentions can form. And on August 2nd, 2007, a brutal crime would send shockwaves through the city. For the residents of Oakland, it begins like any other workday, with a busy morning commute.
It was a sunny, warm morning. There were lots of people out, lots of vehicular traffic, people going to and from work. And then there was just the actual foot traffic.
But around 7:30 a.m., this relatively peaceful routine suddenly erupts into violence.
You know, a man just got his cup of coffee. He's walking to work. Somebody pulls up in a white van, gets out the ski mask with a shotgun.
He saw a guy in black run across the street with a shotgun, and the guy shot him. And when he fell, he rolled over, and then they shot him in the face.
I couldn't believe that it happened in the manner that it did. It was something out of a movie.
Witnesses immediately call 911, and police and paramedics arrive minutes later. But it's far too late to save the victim.
He was pronounced dead on the scene.
Chauncey Bailey was born and raised in Oakland. Chauncey's love of language eventually led him to pursue journalism. After graduating from San Jose University, he worked in Connecticut, Chicago, and Detroit before eventually returning home to work as a cub reporter for the Oakland Post.
The Oakland Post is one of our leading papers out here, especially for the Black community. He was the classic reporter, the one that would get the whole story before he let you know about it.
He came from the old school of hard knocks, shoe leather reporting newspapers and would ask the tough questions.
Chauncey immediately stood out among his peers, not only for his writing, but for his personality as well.
Chauncey was dapper. He always wore suits. He was charming. He was funny. He had a great sense of humor. He was witty.
He was a very personable, very likable, and a very intriguing person.
He was a wonderful storyteller, which is what made Chauncey the reporter that he was.
Chauncey was very passionate. He was someone who cared a lot about the Black community, had strong opinions about Black empowerment and business.
Over the next few years, Chauncey honed his craft, working as a print and TV news reporter. His platform grew even larger in the 1990s when he became a familiar face on the Soul Beat TV network.
Soul Beat was a 24-hour Black-owned television network. It traditionally played music videos, and then it also did interviews.
Soul Beat was awesome. Soul Beat was the thing on cable television. And it was the guy who lived here in this city. They did a lot of incredibly awesome music off of Higginberger Road, which is kind of a pretty famous road here in Oakland.
Chauncey was the news director for Soul Beat.
Oh, Chauncey Bailey from Soul Beat.
Chauncey developed a one-hour news show, and it was pertinent to the Black community because he would deliver a lot of news that wasn't on your local news.
He would do stories about Black women and their efforts to start businesses. He would do stories about young men who were overcoming obstacles. He would also do good stories when Black History Month or other things came up. He would do cultural stories.
He was basically telling stories on the newscast that was ignored by other news outlets.
When Chauncey finally slowed down long enough to start a family, he passed his love of journalism on to his son.
One of the things I really remember about Chauncey was his son, Quincy, who he used to bring into the newsroom and he was very proud of. And he was a kid who sort of grew up before our eyes in the newsroom.
Chauncey's like, I don't care if my son doesn't do anything else, but he's gotta read. I think his son was reading by the time he was 3.
Although the marriage didn't last, Chauncey and his son remained close. And in 2005, Chauncey's career came full circle when he returned to the Oakland Post, this time as editor-in-chief.
Chauncey was like the perfect person to take that job. He really added a lot of experience and depth to that publication at a really important time.
It was a real dope paper. He would do stories that was really important to the community.
Now, just 2 months later, Chauncey has been gunned down in broad daylight, and Oakland police want to know why.
This had been the first time in a very long time that a U.S. journalist was actually killed on U.S. soil. So the level of importance in solving this case, the level of bringing closure and offering answers was paramount.
For those who live and work in Oakland, California, gun violence is a harsh reality.
Oakland, like many urban centers, has its struggles and its challenges. He obviously was known for having lots of crime. It was affected deeply by the drug trade in the 90s.
The high level of violence during the crack epidemic has given Oakland a reputation that has been very hard for us to shake.
In this case with Mr. Bailey, he was an investigative journalist. But because he was so admired and so loved by the community, that it definitely did put a lot of pressure on the police to find the culprits.
Fortunately, it isn't difficult to find witnesses who are able to describe what happened.
There were many people that saw Mr. Bailey get off of the AC Transit public bus and go into the McDonald's.
Chauncey would go there, get his coffee, and then walk to work. That was his routine. You know, you could set your watch by it.
Eyewitnesses say that's when a man wearing a ski mask walked straight towards Chauncey and then shot him. Chauncey's wallet and personal belongings weren't taken, so it doesn't appear to be a robbery.
There wasn't the taking of jewelry. There wasn't the taking of his wallet or credit cards or even an expensive cell phone. None of that was taken. So that's an indicator to the police that this was not about robbery. This had another motive to it.
The gunman used a shotgun to kill Mr. Bailey, shooting the gun upwards to 3 times, depending on the individuals that you talk to. I know for a fact that he was hit twice, the last one execution style as he lay on the ground, already suffering from 1 gunshot wound.
My first thought was that it was probably something personal and not professional, because journalists don't tend to just get shot in the street in the United States.
But according to his colleagues, Chauncey seemed to have more friends than enemies.
Chauncey was a bit of a man about town. He got around, and he was a social animal as well. So he would go to many events, pressers in the afternoon, social things at night, and he had many casual acquaintances.
Chauncey Bailey had an infectious personality. He was very talkative with everyone, men and women.
He also appeared to be on good terms with his ex-wife, despite frustration over their custody arrangement.
His son lived down in Southern California. He would always talk about how he wished his son could come up here and live with him in Oakland.
Anytime you may have a situation where somebody has that kind of a background, from an investigative standpoint, you have to look at every angle of an investigation. Could it be a personal relationship that motivated revenge in some kind?
Former colleague Zima Wyatt recalls an incident that happened shortly before his death.
We were riding to a press conference at City Hall, and I noticed that he was acting real quiet. And he said, "Zima, I feel like someone is following me." Jokingly, really not believing that someone was really following him. First thing I said was, "What woman is trying to kill you now?" He's like, "No, Zima, someone is following me, and I think they're trying to kill me." And the way that he said, "No, Zima," let me know something was wrong, but I just still couldn't fathom that someone was trying to kill him.
Chauncey's family suspects it wasn't a former girlfriend, but someone with a grudge against Chauncey for his hard-hitting journalism.
When you're seeking to get at the truth and you're trying to hold power to account, you have to ask questions that people don't necessarily want to answer. He probably had a list of detractors and people who thought of him unfavorably.
But which one of them hated Chauncey enough to commit murder?
It became very evident that there were other things going on in his life that could have led to violence.
The assassination of Chauncey Bailey wasn't the first time that something of that nature had happened or been associated with the city of Oakland. Back in the early 1970s, one of the first Black superintendents, Marcus Foster, was assassinated by the SLA.
And the Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland.
As controversial as the Black Panthers were, their leaders were committed to the people of Oakland. This led to a mistrust between the police.
Oakland lost a piece of that legacy when 57-year-old journalist Chauncey Bailey was gunned down.
Chauncey Bailey being killed was a grim reminder to everyone in the community because he was so well known and so well loved.
The entire city was affected by his death, most of all his fellow journalists.
We started doing the stories, of course, from the day that he was shot and killed. What does that really mean about what's happening in our country when the foundation of a democracy is the First Amendment?
But despite all of the media attention, detectives still had very little to go on.
Every lead, every rumor that came back was all proved to be not accurate.
There wasn't no jealous husband or nothing like that. You couldn't think of why did it happen.
Investigators hope a thorough examination of the crime scene evidence will create a lead.
There were 2 shotgun shell casings that we located at the scene, and they were in fairly close range to the body. When a shotgun is fired and then it's chambered, the shell casing pops out, falls to the ground,
that casing was collected.
It was clear due to the actual gunshot wounds and the damage done and the casings on the scene that a 12-gauge shotgun was used to shoot and execute Mr. Bailey.
One of the first things that an investigator will do is to run those shells through ballistics to see whether or not there have been any other crimes that have been committed pertaining to those shells or that particular type of weapon.
The shotgun shells turn out to be a perfect match for several others found at 2 different murder scenes the previous month.
I was in the middle of a major investigation involving the 2 murders of Odell Roberson and Michael Wills. I had SWAT teams on standby, ready to take this case down the very next morning.
The weapon used had been traced to employees working at a popular local establishment, Your Black Muslim Bakery.
Your Black Muslim Bakery has been operating for decades. They started in multiple locations throughout Oakland, but found a home in North Oakland, which was on the border of Berkeley and Oakland.
It isn't a place anyone would normally associate with crime. The store was founded in 1968 by owner Yusuf Bey, who was inspired by the teachings of the Nation of Islam to provide opportunities for young Black men.
I remember when I would see the Black Muslims walking down the street with their bow ties and pies and clean and dapper and respectable. It was a source of pride for me as a young African-American man.
They used it as a business opportunity to sell food and beverage, as well as to educate the community, feed the less fortunate individuals, and be a sanctuary for people in the neighborhood who need assistance, but at the same time, being able to help themselves.
The Your Black Muslim Bakery, they preached a lot of self-reliance and young Black men, if you need a place to go, if you're disenfranchised, you can come here, we'll put you to work.
Over the years, the business had expanded, taking on a different kind of role in the community.
They had a very large footprint with their bakery, multiple residence apartments, as well as facilities where they provided childcare, lunch locations, and other community outreach.
They had a vast security force, and they hired them out to events.
One thing about Muslim security is, like, if you seen them somewhere, nobody would act up. Their security was tight, period. Folks had respect for it.
Their security forces were around town with their red bow ties. A lot of folks who lived in the neighborhood were...
A number of crimes across the spectrum that were taking place there.
In 2005, 6 members of the Black Muslim Bakery were arrested in a faith-related crime spree.
There were some liquor stores in West Oakland that the bakery objected to because they said their part of the religion prohibits the consumption of alcohol. So one evening, a bunch of these guys from the bakery go down there with baseball bats and just destroy all the bottles. And there's this poor immigrant guy trying to run a shop there so he can feed his family.
But why would the bakery want to get rid of Chauncey Bailey? The city of Oakland has long been known for its political activism.
Oakland was always the engine that drove causes in the Bay Area. We'll be the first to legalize something, or we'll be the first to push a button.
Yusuf Bey built his store, Your Black Muslim Bakery, on the dream of shaping a better world for Oakland's Black community. But his son had different ideas.
Yusuf Bey Sr., he died in the early 2000s. And upon his passing, he left the bakery to 3 or 4 older gentlemen that had been working throughout the years. Antar Bey, who was 20 or 21 years old, he was young, but he wanted to have possession of the bakery. There was a clash between the young and the old. There was a bookkeeper at the bakery by the name of Wajid. He disappeared. Sometime later, his body was discovered buried in a shallow grave in East Oakland.
Upon his disappearance, the other older gentlemen decided they wanted nothing more to do with this, which left Antar to run the bakery.
After Antar was killed in a carjacking, his brother Yusuf Bey IV took over and followed in his footsteps. Now police have reason to believe employees of the bakery were involved in the murder of Chauncey Bailey. And on August 3rd, less than 24 hours after Chauncey was shot, they conduct a raid on the bakery's buildings. The raids produced 7 arrests and a cache of evidence.
We found evidence that linked members of the Your Black Muslim Bakery to not only the 2 murders that we were investigating, but other crimes that were under investigation as well.
And in a bizarre twist, the most damning piece of evidence literally lands at investigators' feet.
That's actually pretty normal behavior for a suspect to try to get rid of evidence. Whether it's a drug dealer and he's trying to flush drugs, or it's somebody trying to shred documents. One of the suspects, the idiot, thought that he was going to throw away evidence and threw the gun out the window, and it landed right in front of the police.
The bakery's leader, Yusuf Bey IV, and the man who tossed the gun, 19-year-old Devondre Broussard, are among those taken into custody. Broussard is a handyman at the bakery with a long rap sheet.
Mr. Broussard was a polycriminal. He had multiple arrests for an assortment of crimes. Originally, Mr. Broussard indicated that he was not responsible for the murder of Mr. Bailey, that he had nothing to do with it. He was adamant that he was not responsible, that he didn't, in fact, participate in the murder of Mr. Bailey.
Yusuf Bey IV also claims he's innocent, but says he knows who was responsible.
Yusuf Bey IV, he indicated that others may have done things thinking that they were doing for him at his behest. And he went so far as to basically point me in the direction of who it was, which was Mr. Broussard.
What we have is a crime boss pointing the finger at one of his underlings. And as an investigator, you don't want to let anybody off the hook, big fish or little fish.
Mr. Broussard indicated he wanted to speak to Yusuf Bey IV alone for just a few minutes, and then after that, he would tell us the truth.
Detectives put Yusuf and Broussard in the same room together. The unconventional move quickly pays off.
We stepped out of the room. I think I checked my watch. I think I gave them 4 minutes.
So the police leave Devondre and Yusuf in a room together. And the police come back, and all of a sudden, Devondre is singing a different tune.
Mr. Broussard proceeded to tell me that he was, in fact, the shooter of Mr. Bailey. He said he did it because Mr. Bailey was going to write something about the bakery.
Investigative journalism has a lot in common with what police do. Sometimes their work can actually lead to the solving of a case.
The Center for Investigative Reporting, the nation's first nonprofit journalism organization, got its beginnings in Oakland.
They focus on aspects of the investigation that the police just didn't have the resources to follow up on.
The city of Oakland is still reeling from the murder of well-respected journalist Chauncey Bailey. And on August 8th, 2007, they show up to pay their last respects.
The service was huge. It looked like everybody in Oakland was there. That was a testament of what Chauncey meant to people.
Chauncey was committed to the city of Oakland, and in particular the Black community. He reported on the good things that helped Oakland, and the bad things that were destroying Oakland.
His death didn't just devastate people. It took something away from us.
Among the mourners who fill St. Benedict's Church in East Oakland is publisher Paul Cobb, who vows to continue Chauncey's work investigating your Black Muslim bakery.
This community will know what Chauncey Bailey and I were working on.
An employee of the bakery, 19-year-old Devondre Broussard, has been held without bond after confessing to the crime. Broussard claims he acted alone, killing Chauncey to stop him from finishing a scathing article about the bakery and its patriarch, Yusuf Bey.
Yusuf Bey, the senior, had been charged with inappropriate conduct with young women for rape. The noose was tightening around that empire, and Chauncey had reported on this. Yusuf Bey, he had gotten cancer and ultimately died before going through the trial. But his son, Yusuf Bey IV, always hated Chauncey for reporting on those stories.
Although they can't prove it yet, Chauncey's colleagues believe Yusuf Bey IV ordered Broussard to carry out the hit.
You had newspaper people, you had TV people, you had radio people, all coming together.
We formed the Chauncey Bailey Project. It was reminiscent to me of the assassination of Bowles in Arizona those many years ago, which was a very big deal.
They took it upon themselves to actually continue the investigation and make sure that Chauncey Bailey's murder was not in vain and that all people responsible were held accountable.
That task becomes more difficult when Broussard's lawyers instruct him to withdraw his statement, claiming his confession was coerced by Sergeant Longmire of the Oakland Police.
First, Broussard is denying this murder. Then they let Bey come in, have a conversation with him. And then after the conversation, Broussard admits to the murder. But they don't record it.
The media felt that there was something not right about all of it. They felt that something was afoot. So they started looking and creating.
Now, I don't personally think that Longmire was dirty, but I think that he left himself open to criticism. There was a feeling that he was sort of too close to Bey.
It comes out that Sergeant Longmire had known Yusuf Bey IV for 2 years and cultivated a personal relationship with him. Some believe it is a conflict of interest that allowed Bey to evade arrest.
There was one good, strong voice in the Oakland Police Department that kept saying to the command staff, that bakery is a criminal enterprise and we need to do something about it. But his ability to establish a rapport with people that were really difficult to communicate with was used against him.
OPD homicide were the darlings of the media. A short time later, when they found out that Yusuf Bey IV was not being charged, we became the black sheep.
The Oakland Police Department faces even sharper criticism when the Chauncey Bailey Project uncovers a shocking revelation about the raid on the bakery.
It was initially planned for a day or two before Mr. Bailey's murder.
The morning of August 2nd, when Chauncey Bailey was murdered, our homicide section was in the middle of investigating multiple murders involving the Your Black Muslim Bakery.
The police and SWAT teams delayed it because there were a couple people who were on a camping trip.
The two guys who were supposed to be leading this task force to shut down the bakery had gone up to the Sierras to go camping and fishing, and they were a little bit late coming back, so they called the then chief of police and said, hey, we're not going to be able to make it for this raid. Can you postpone it for a day or two? And guess what happened the next day because the raid didn't take place? They shot and killed Chauncey Bailey. Now, the police department command staff was in a very embarrassing situation. They could have prevented this if they had just done their police duty.
To combat the negative press, Police Chief Wayne Tucker takes the highly unusual step of imposing a gag order. The ensuing controversy causes Chauncey's murder investigation to grind to a halt.
There were 3 internal investigations, 1 DOJ investigation, and 1 federal institution that had made some inquiries on this. So it received so much incredible scrutiny.
I truly believe there was paralysis by analysis when it came to this investigation.
Then in June of 2008, the Chauncey Bailey Project releases a video they've obtained, which seems to finally prove Yusuf Bey IV was involved.
So there's a key moment in the investigation when we got a hold of this footage of them being interviewed.
We were able to see the videotape of Yusuf Bey and two of his compatriots, not realizing that everything was being recorded.
So I gave him my gun, the one that they used.
Yusuf Bey was bragging about the crime, essentially. And he wasn't saying, I'm the one who was instrumental behind it, I ordered it. And that's what I was waiting for, is to hear something like that.
That's no different than any street hood bragging about a murder that he heard about or that he saw. So you don't have enough material there to charge or to move forward with Mr. Bey.
He was the sucker. He wasn't a soldier, as Bey used to call him, but rather that he was a dupe. And that he should not go down for Yusuf Bey when it was Yusuf Bey who was the mastermind of this.
Facing life in prison, Broussard agrees to plead guilty and testify against his employer, Yusuf Bey IV.
The shotgun, and these guys are loyal soldiers, so you know they're gonna do anything for him.
On August 2nd, Broussard and Mackey stalk Chauncey Bailey on his way to work, waiting for the right moment to strike.
They saw Chauncey Bailey come from his house, and the plan was to execute him right there. Unfortunately,
Mackey is also charged, and on March 21st, 2011, both he and Bey stand trial in Alameda County.
The trial was pretty sensational. I had dozens and dozens of news crews and newspaper folk and everybody else and their brother-in-law.
Along with Broussard's damning testimony, prosecutors show the jury a tape of Yusuf Bey IV joking about Chauncey's death.
It was really important evidence because he knew explicitly what happened. It had been reported to him hours or an hour after Devondre had executed him on his orders.
That's what said, wow, wow.
The defense attempts to discredit Broussard's testimony, calling him a liar who'd already changed his story several times.
If they can find something that will discredit somebody as far as their character or their credibility or their integrity in some way, they'll use anything and everything that they can against the other person.
Fortunately for justice, the Alameda County District Attorney had a great prosecutor in Melissa Crum, who brought the case home.
The Yusuf Bey IV was convicted of all three murders.
Antoine Mackey is also convicted. Both he and Bey received consecutive life sentences with no chance for parole. For his role, Broussard receives 25 years. The city of Oakland was forever changed by the murder of Chauncey Bailey. Not only because he is missed, but because his case ultimately brought about the kind of reform he fought for during his career.
If you fast forward to present day, Oakland has been deemed one of the safest cities around. We have been nationally recognized as far as dropping our violence rate.
I think Chauncey was one of those unsung heroes that people didn't get what he was attempting to do until after he was murdered.
Journalism can be a risky business, but we do it because we love it and because we believe in the role that journalism plays in our society and in our democracy. Chauncey didn't deserve to be shot down in the street for trying to do his job.
Chauncey Bailey's death should not be in vain, but rather a time when we can remember that a free press is in fact the very foundation of a democracy.